So now, welcome to the Temple Lectures, which are held for the Bishop of Blackburn, and we're waiting for a new bishop, Julian, and the Bishop of Burnley was to be with us but is not able to be here. So welcome to the second of these two Temple Lectures, and the welcome is on behalf of the Dean and Chapter who host these lectures. Simon Hughes, now here on my right, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats since 2010, formerly President of the party and its Home Affairs spokesman. He's also had briefs in other areas, including health and education, and is currently advocate for access to education, which was referenced in our earlier discussion. Simon is a widely respected parliamentarian with a strong record in matters of equality, social justice and concern for the marginalised. Once he was given an award as the most motivated MP. He served in the House of Commons for over 30 years, since the Bermondsey by-election in February 1983. Of course, that was not Simon's first venture into politics, nor was it his first election. In the very early 1970s, Simon stood as a student representative at Selwyn College, Cambridge, and some of us supported him and voted for him. He stood as a centre-left candidate, I believe. Simon, of course, is well known to many as a sane, sensible, thoughtful and courteous spokesman on many issues, and appears regularly on BBC's Question Time. Simon supports Glamorgan County Cricket Club and Welsh Rugby Union, and believe it or not, is a Millwall supporter, and they have quite a reputation. I know that as a Stoke supporter. But I'm told that he also supports Hereford, and I support Blackburn as well as Stoke. And I've learnt today that sleeping is listed as one of Simon's recreations. Tonight, Simon is addressing issues of social justice from a Christian perspective. Over to you, Simon.
Ian, thank you very much, and it's really lovely to see you again. And I apologise for not being here at 7 o'clock. The planners of my life told me that if I caught the 15:34 from Euston and changed at Stockport, it would all be wonderful. But unfortunately, we didn't get to Stockport in time to catch the connection, so life began to be a bit complicated. I'm sure you've all had those sorts of experiences on the London-Blackburn trip before, so I apologise for that. It means you've had a double act, I gather, before, which I'm sure is means your money's worth, not that you've been paying large amounts of money, but your money's worth has been obtained, and you have theologians as well as politicians. I was going to refer to Millwall, actually, because we play each other sometimes, and I was here. I thought what I'd do is I'd come and get revenge for the fact that the last game in Millwall you beat us 2-1, and I took my mate, who's the MP for Burnley, who's a Blackburn Rovers supporter, to the game, hoping we would be able to see him off and he'd be able to go home with a tail between his legs, but unfortunately you won. It's the only time I've known a fight nearly break out in the boardroom, which I have to say is slightly unusual. I won't tell you quite who started it, but it's very good to be here. I've been in this cathedral once before, many years ago, and my younger brother nearly married, in fact was engaged to somebody from Blackburn once, but in the end he married somebody from Bermondsey, so there you are. You can draw from that what you will. I was born in the northwest. I hope I have some street cred in this part of the world, when Dad was working up here. And another couple of things. We have a sort of common heritage in one sense, in that Blackburn, obviously a diocese created out of a bigger diocese, an older diocese of Manchester. My local cathedral is Southwark, a diocese created out of, now this will be a test for you actually, out of Winchester Diocese in 1905, so slightly older, but a newer, old cathedral, but newer diocese. It's lovely to be here. The other thing I probably feel I can tell you, without spoiling your evening, is that Andy Murray's 1 set all in the semi-final. Because you will have seen the previous game, those of you interested in tennis, which was the longest men's singles semi-final ever at Wimbledon, apparently. If there'd been an uneven score, I wouldn't have told you because that would have spoilt it. But as it's 1 set all, just become 1 set all as I came in, I think I can share that with you without spoiling your enjoyment or my enjoyment later. It actually probably means that if I go quickly, you'll be at home in time for the end, so I have an incentive. It's an honour to be asked, Ian, seriously. Archbishop Temple is one of those great figures of Church of England history as an advocate for social justice. I reflected rather troublingly that I'm just approaching the age when he became Archbishop and then very sadly died pretty soon after he became Archbishop in office. I think he was the last Archbishop to die in office. Not an old man at all. I also told Jack Straw I was coming because Jack's been the MP for here as long as I've been the MP for Bermondsey and a bit longer. We're in the top 25 longest serving team, so we see each other fairly often, and that made me think, oh, it's bound to be full of all those hardened Labour supporters. But then I looked back and I saw that there have of course been famous Liberals in Blackburn. Was the famous Lord Morley, who was minister for many occasions in many governments, I think before any of you were alive, but there's a good Liberal credential. So that's the sort of scene setting which is nothing to do with the theme. We've sometimes confused our politics and our theology. I was in the House of Commons this morning for an unusual Friday sitting, which was the debate on the European referendum bill, which is this private member's bill by a Tory backbencher. And Frank Field was on the Labour benches, and he intervened, and by a slip of the tongue said, sometimes in the European Communion, and then he suddenly corrected himself, sometimes politics and theology of church issues get mixed. What I thought I'd do, and Ian's just very kindly briefed me on what you've been talking about, is share with you just a few facts, just very simply, just share a few facts with you, and then share with you a very, 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 very brief summary of what appears to be the history of social justice, just 5 minutes, just less than that, in terms of it being a concept that people talk about and a phrase that people use. Share with you 2 or 3, probably 5 or 6, short quotes from the Old Testament and New Testament, which seem to me actually say something quite interesting about what Christ taught about social justice. And then share with you what I think may be agenda items for us all, and a challenge to you as a diocese and you as people in the church here, as to things you might wish to pick up and take on, because a practical application of an hour spent or 2 hours spent in the cathedral is probably more useful than just ruminating on the theology or the teaching, if that's okay. And then I'm very happy to take some questions if you still have any patience or energy left. When I spoke to Ian on the phone from Manchester Victoria Station, having just missed the connection, I said, well, you can entertain them in the first half, then you can give them coffee. So we don't have any coffee. And I thought, this is pretty grim, but he tells me that he's rustled up enough, so you have at least had some refreshment before part 2. A couple of facts then. In 1918, the top 1% of the wealth of the country, top 1% in terms of wealth, own nearly 20% of all, had nearly 20% of all taxable income. So 1 in 100 people had a fifth of the income coming into any households in Britain. It went down considerably in the years after that. So by 1948, it was 11% went to the top 1%. And by the mid-70s, it was 6%. But sadly, on the latest figures we've got, it's back up to 15%. So we've had a century in which we saw considerable reduction in inequality of income, up to the Second World War, through the Second World War, post-war, right through the Labour and Tory governments of the 50s and 60s and 70s. But then, bluntly, since Mrs. T, since 79, it started to change, and it wasn't changed under the Labour government either. And interestingly, it is just beginning to change now, counterintuitively, because I think people sort of presume that if there are Tories in government, it must be that there is a greater income, although the rich list, I meant to bring with me the rich list for the North West. The rich list shows that there are obviously huge amounts of income coming into small numbers of people in this region as everywhere else. Second, so that's income. Those are income figures. Second set of figures, wealth inequality, all assets, physical and pension funds and shares and stocks, everything else. 1% of the country had 2/3 of all the assets in 1912. So at the same time, I'm looking back 100 years, 1% had 2/3 of all the assets. Again, it has been reducing until recently when it's been growing again. So the graphs are consistent on both income and wealth. Wealth is held much more often by men than by women, twice as often, in fact, and most often by people between 40 and 65, self-evidently in a way, but just confirming what we'd imagine. 3 out of 5 families in Britain receive some form of benefit or help from the state. Obviously, it could be tax credits, a lot of it would be pensions, but 3 out of 5 people receive something. Interesting, because all the opinion polls show that welfare reform, reducing benefits to people, is very popular. Not just the Daily Mail that says it, it's 80% plus on opinion polls say we need to cut benefits and not, I mean, there are all sorts of unpleasant phrases, but not give handouts to scoundrels. And lastly, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who are highly reputable and obviously a very good thing, good Quaker stock, say that currently their best estimate is to have all the reasonable necessities of life in this country for a family with 2 parents and 2 children. You need £514 a week after tax. And that's an interesting figure. If you then apply that figure on the latest figures, and I'm always nervous about the phrases, but I'll share them with you, 17% of the families in the country are below that poverty line, are below that normal needs line. And obviously it varies hugely in different parts of the country. That's all the facts I'm going to share with you, but I just share with you, I hope, something which says we still have a challenge in this country, and the challenge is rising again, not diminishing. I'm sure you instinctively know that, but I hope it's helpful to share that. Chapter 2, just quickly skim social justice, where's it come? Interestingly, I'll come back to the Bible in a second, but the use of the phrase in the churches has really had a pedigree of only a couple of hundred years. Although, and I'm not the theologian, Thomas Aquinas is probably the theologian who most would be associated with a justice gospel over the last 1,000 years. Nonetheless, it was picked up by the Jesuits in the 19th century as a teaching, somebody called Luigi Taparelli, and actually led by the Roman Catholics. And it's interesting that if you look through the history of denominations of the Christian churches, the 2 churches which appear most to have promoted social justice are the Roman Catholics and the Methodists. Wesleyism, Methodism was clearly all about social justice, and the whole Methodist movement was very much driven by that. I mean, you'd argue the Quakers too. Interestingly, the most recent proclamation of significance, or hierarchy significance, was the last Pope, who said something that I think is very interesting, that justice is the defining concern of the state and the central cause of politics, whereas the Church has as its central concern charity and love. Quite an interesting analysis. I know you were talking a bit, Ian told me, about big state, small state issues. And actually, Pope Benedict was saying these are politics issues. The Church should be somewhere else, loving people, not necessarily struggling for structural change. This was a sixth form, I could say. Write your essay about that. Sometimes, of course, it's been associated not with general issues, but with specifics. So, in Methodism, one of the social justice issues was prison reform. Another was abolition of slavery, obviously. I think it's fair to say that that inheritance in this last century meant that quite a lot of organisations internationally had social justice as part of their criteria for action. So, for example, I didn't know this till I was thinking about this event this week and before I came to talk to you, but the International Labour Organization, which is about fair wages around the world and proper labour rights and so on, has as its definition of its justification, universal and lasting peace, it says in its preamble, can be established only if based on social justice. And actually, I've always thought that, I do quite a lot of work on conflict resolution and conflict prevention, that actually you will only get peace if you have justice as a precondition, often. And if you don't believe me, I'm sure you do, but go to Israel and Palestine and you will see it manifested all the time. Some people argue that social justice should be a purpose of human rights education. So if you educate people about their rights of people, then social justice will follow from that. So there's good sort of authentic, both Christian argument for it in the last 200 years, less before, less traditionally associated with Protestantism generally, or Anglicanism in particular. I guess the summary would be that it's about fairness and mutual obligation. Quite a lot of teaching in Judaism about justice. Jonathan Sacks has written about it and spoken about it a lot. I was privileged to be at his sort of farewell retirement due the other day after 22 years as chief rabbi. And it's quite a strong characteristic in Islam. And we could obviously on another occasion unpick that. That leads to Archbishop Temple and the Bible, which is where I think there are some interesting conclusions. There's one quote which you will probably all know from Archbishop Temple, which actually the quote that everybody knows most, probably, I assume, and all you people are probably experts about this, is that the Church is the only society that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members. That's a very good sort of basis of why we're all here. I remember Owen Chadwick, who was our master at Selwyn, telling us when he was a visiting professor at Heidelberg University. He went to a service in a little church in the forest or something, and everybody else in the congregation was over 65 or 75 or 85 or something, and there was only him who was sort of youthful relatively. And the preacher preached to them all to go out and convert the world and go out energetically and run the race. He was looking around at all these people thinking it was clearly directed at him, but it made him reflect that actually we should spend less time haranguing the people in the pews and more time going out and do what Jack does, I gather, in the town square, which is harangue the people every Saturday from his soapbox and preach to the unconverted rather than converted. But the other quote that I found, which I thought was relevant, is Archbishop Temple, "My worth is what I am worth to God, and that is a marvellous great deal, for Christ died for me. Thus, incidentally, what gives to each of us his highest worth gives the same worth to everyone. in all that matters most, we are equal. And then, let me just give you, I could have given you 100, but I'm going to give you just a few Old Testament and New Testament quotes and just make a comment about this. I say to you, whatever you did for one of the least of these my children, you did for me. The end of that Matthew chapter about the separation between the sheep and the goats. It's the politicians chapter in the Bible, really. Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Isaiah 1. One of the most famous other verses, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And then a quick selection of others, Matthew 7:12, the golden rule, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Luke 4:18 and 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Luke 10, from verse 30. Predictably, I guess, Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was passing down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to a place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But the Samaritan, while travelling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. And lastly, Romans 12:15. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep, live in harmony with one another, do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Now, I don't know what you think, but it does seem to me that, surprisingly in a way, Jesus' teaching in particular, and the Old Testament teaching, is mainly about individual responsibility and not collective responsibility. The most controversial sentence Mrs. Thatcher ever uttered, I think, was, there is no such thing as society. To be fair to her, she then went on to say, but only groups of individuals who come together. I can't quite remember the rest of the quote. I think the church actually, my gospel is, I don't believe in the establishment of the church, and I think the Church of England should be disestablished and should never have been established, and we should, if we could, be disestablished as soon as we could be, because I don't think churches and the establishment go well together. And I think we ought to be outside the establishment as the church, and we ought to be challenging the establishment all the time, and it's very frustrating. It is encouraging that the new Archbishop has elements of his character which suggest that he shares that view, and the Pope certainly appears to have elements of his character that immediately show he's not willing just to inherit the establishment mantle, literally, and is willing to step outside and be with the people rather than with the people at St. Peter's. So that's all very encouraging. But it seems to me the church has missed out quite often in preaching and arguing for the structural changes that are the social justice issues collectively, as opposed to what we should do personally. And it can challenge the individual rich person, rich in income, rich in wealth, to give their money to the poor. But actually we've got bigger issues, and you were talking about them, and I therefore just want to share with you what I think they are, and then I'm going to leave you just with some thoughts as to where the church in Blackburn Diocese and everywhere else might want to go with that in the years ahead, and when you engage with politicians in local elections, in the European elections next year, in the general election 2015, it seems to me there are real issues where the church, I think now, could make a very big impact if it wanted to. I know the synod is meeting, so the two reasons people may not be here with good excuses are watching the tennis and being at the synod. The synod, I've been a member of the synod very briefly once. The synod, whatever it really does, has only been reported as being exercised about two issues over the last 5 years, which are women bishops, which I support, and gay people, priests, bishops, marriages, and so on and so forth. The sooner the church can get off those two hooks, it seemed to me, and be talking about the social justice issues, probably the more people will come through the doors, and the more we will be effective in our communities. I'm not saying they're not important. We need to address them, but it seems to me there's a much bigger set of issues. So, Ian, I've just sort of almost listed them because there's not time to spend time on each. The first is clearly to do with money. We've had debates this week in Parliament about tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax havens, corporate responsibility. Big issue, big issue. I've just been asked by The Guardian today to comment on the fact that we've now discovered that pretty well none of the mobile phone companies pay any tax. We've previously just discovered none of the water companies pay any tax, and the Googles and the Starbucks and so on. So there are loads of people, loads of big companies who just don't pay, and the rest of us have to pay for the things because they're not doing so. So there are income and wealth issues, I alluded to those. There are tax issues and the fairness of tax. I mean, just to share with you, you might think it's propaganda, but interestingly, the top 20% of people are clearly losing out most in this government through austerity, although you wouldn't think so by some of the arguments about the tax rate, because although the tax rate has come down a bit, the top tax rate, actually other taxes have gone up. So they've done relatively worst, as they should in my book, because they do relatively better. But actually the people in the bottom 20% have done the next worst, because getting people out of the bottom 20%, even if you lift the tax threshold, is very difficult. Pay and bonuses. I mean, we have ridiculous amounts of pay for certain people, including footballers. I mean, it seems to be completely unacceptable and unnecessary. And the bonus culture we had with bankers and non-bankers, and the personal debt that everybody was getting into and encouraged to get into for house purchase seemed to be entirely the wrong way to go. So I think the church has a lot where we could get engaged. And the really good thing this week is that the Archbishop said, what about really being seen to be the organisation supporting credit unions and lending that's not usurious? And there's lots of preaching in Old and New Testaments about that, and in other in Islam too. And I had a very good exchange with Tony Baldry, who's the Second Church of States Commissioner in the Commons yesterday, and we're going to have a three-party delegation to go to see business department ministers to say, come on, let's cap payday loans, not faff around for any longer, let's cap the top limit, and let's really roll out credit unions and places where people who need to can borrow at minimal. And I think the church could play a huge role in that social justice of lending and social justice of access to finance. The second is in housing. It's a bigger issue in some ways in my part of the world than here, because the gap between average income and average house prices, I mean, it's just silly prices in London SE1. But there are other issues too. 75% of all new properties completed last year in London were sold to people abroad. A lot of them sold off plan to companies in Malaysia and China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and so on. I mean, there is no chance for people to be able to get onto the housing ladder, to get in. I mean, the whole thing has become ridiculous. So there's a real challenge to make sure the battle which the Quakers were very good at, Bourneville, the Cadburys, York, and so on, providing affordable housing for the workers, providing suitable housing at cost people can afford, providing council housing again. The Scots have just decided, or the Welsh have just decided this week, the Scots I think, to get rid of the right to buy. I've always said we should leave it to local councils to get rid of the right to buy in England as is done in Wales. I think it's a real debate that the church can lead about how we allow people not necessarily to buy their own place, but have rented places or shared ownership places that are possible given the income. If we can't provide adequate housing, and we can't at the moment, then we are really failing in terms of a social issue, because children can't grow up with the best chances if they don't have a space to do their homework, or just to be quiet, or mum doesn't, or whatever. So housing is the second. The third is the whole debate about the welfare state. It's the 65th anniversary of the NHS today. Happy birthday, NHS, which is wonderful, still in spite of its failings from time to time. I think the church can continue to argue that the changes started by Liberals, continued by Labour, national insurance, state pension 100 years ago, and then the NHS 65 years ago, are fundamentally civilised social justice mechanisms, and we need to absolutely defend them as far as possible. They've never been perfect. From the very beginning, if you remember, Nye Bevan conceded that he'd have to fill the doctors' mouths with gold and to get them to come into the NHS. From the very beginning, people have had to pay a bit for dental care and so on, so it's never been a completely taxpayer-funded service, but we've really got to keep the principle there. And the debate about the benefits system, it should be, if you go back and look at all the history of Beveridge, who also was a Liberal, and a welfare state, Beveridge's argument wasn't that you had a welfare state that allowed people not to work. It should always have been there as an incentive to work. And I think we need the support system, but that's always encouraging people, including people with illness and disability, if they can, to be able to get into work. Which leads me to the fourth thing, and this is very under-argued, and I would really ask you to take it up. I think we need not just redistribution of wealth, but redistribution of work. Pause for a second. About a third of the people in this country are either unemployed or underemployed and would like to do more and need to do more. About a third of people are reasonably employed and they're very happy, they have the right life-work balance. About a third of people are hugely overemployed. I do 80 hours a week. Normally, that's absolutely normal. And I'm not the only person doing 80 hours a week. Most people who do my job do 80 hours a week. And many other people, particularly in their 30s to 50s, do silly hours and don't feel they can ever climb off. And it's not good for them. It produces relationship breakdown, family stress, mental illness, and all those other things. Actually, the companies that employ should not be employing fewer people and paying them more. They should be employing more people and paying them less. So there's a real issue in spreading work around. And when unemployment exists, and it will always exist to some extent, it's not, thank God, nearly as big here as it is in places like Spain, which are dreadful. Nonetheless, actually one of the ways is to share work and not, whilst we're creating more jobs, of course we need more work. So the redistribution of work, I would ask that you take up. There are still real issues of gender inequality, a real social issue. If you look at the pay gaps, if you look at the basic wages, if you look at the spread of jobs, if you look at opportunities, I don't think there's any justification in 2013 for a society where it is always going to be much more difficult if you're a woman to be able to have parity in income or wealth. I mean, it seems to me that there's a real battle to fight. There's a real issue still with racial inequality. I know that Blackburn has, second to London, the highest Muslim community in England. And in some parts of the Muslim community, particularly, for example, the Bangladeshi community, I represent a large number of Bangladeshis, there are real inequalities in terms of opportunity and educational outcomes. And we must never generalize, because different bits of different, for example, Asian communities do differentially well and less well in education. So it's not simplistic. But there are real inequality issues. And I think we need to know them and champion them and make sure that the Church of England schools, for example, and schools generally, are really finding those who are struggling, both whole groups and whole communities and whole people from particular backgrounds, but really producing those sorts of inequalities. It's a real social issue. You know, if people are not well placed at 14 educationally, or if they come out of education not into work, they do less well for the rest of their lives in terms of wages and income and satisfaction and all the other things. So there's a real challenge. Subsidiarily, just because it's obviously topical, the House of Lords is coming back to equal marriage next week, there has been obviously a sexuality inequality in civic terms. Don't get into the debate about the faith issues, which are more complex, but in civic terms that's been an issue, and I hope is being righted. Just 4 more things. There seems to be still religious injustice, and although we rightly take up arms on behalf of Christians around the world who are persecuted, and they are, and they get a hard time in places like Pakistan, actually it is still often the case that if you're Jewish or if you're Muslim in this country, you are much more likely to be a victim of hate crime and so on. There's been a real rise in Islamophobia since the Woolwich bombings, and my friend Fires McGall, who runs an organisation called Faith Matters, has done reporting of the reports made, and I think we just have to be really conscious that it's a real social issue to make sure that people of all faiths feel equally loved and protected and supported and have equal rights and don't have unequal vilification. There's a real issue for all of us, and the majority faith community has a duty to lead on that, it seems to me, in coalition with particularly the other monotheistic faiths, but not only that. Couple to go. There's an issue about intergenerational equality, and it's environmental issues really. Unless we steward, the church is quite good on this issue, but unless we are much better at stewarding what we've got, then we are likely to bequeath our children and grandchildren less equal opportunities in terms of enjoying the countryside. Biodiversity, bees are a topic, a little sub-issue, for example. But really importantly, I think we have a real duty to make sure we don't leave our green and pleasant land less green and less pleasant, and all the other lands less green and less pleasant. So there's a real challenge, which for me is a social issue. Last but one, I've got a question I want to leave with you really, as to how we challenge different organisations. There are obligations on government, there are public responsibilities, but it shouldn't mean that private organisations or individuals or companies don't have responsibility too. And I think we have to be very much more effective at having private corporate social responsibility. Again, the Archbishop's very well placed to argue that, having been there in the oil industry and in the private sector for much of his adult life. Companies have to be responsible citizens. They have to pay fairly, they have to employ properly, they have to recruit fairly, they have to have global policies that work. And it's a real social issue to make sure all our companies, small and big, have corporate responsibility. And I think the Church has a duty to engage with chambers of commerce and trade unions and everybody else to make sure that the private sector doesn't escape from these issues. It's no good just challenging the politicians and the councillors and the county councillors and the MPs and the MEPs. The rest of us too. And then lastly, there are things which are the sort of niche issues which are difficult, some of them under the radar. We're debating at the moment how the UK should comply with the European Court ruling that we should not have a blanket ban on prisoners having a vote. Not a populist issue arguing that prisoners should have a vote, but I've been to countries where on election day in Finland, for example, I saw prisoners voting, the sky didn't fall in, I didn't notice the earth shaking, revolution was not occurring. It seems to me there's a moderate answer which says that obviously for certain things you may lose your rights, but if you're in prison for a very short time, it's probably better that you're engaged in the processes that are going to influence what happens. So, there's that debate. There's the debate about trafficking of people. It's a hidden issue. There is still slavery. There are still people, either domestic servants, people who don't have an immigration status, who therefore have no power to own up and are kept in employment below the radar. and people who are imported for prostitution and sexual services and all the other things. So that there are those social issues, the difficult social issues in the sort of dark corners of our society. And then there are the complicated issues about how we get right the balance of immigration. I always think that when I was brought up, I had a globe in my bedroom, and you probably had globes in your bedroom, and it had lots of red on it as to the bits of the world that we ran once, which was about a third of the world, which is now the Commonwealth. My history suggests that we didn't go and ask everybody if we could take over their countries. I can't remember us going and saying, do you mind if we come in? We think you've got rather good gold or iron or copper or something, and we'd rather like to export it, but if you'll be willing to let us do it, we'd be grateful. East India Company. I sort of got the impression we went for economic reasons because we wanted it for us. It therefore doesn't surprise me if I have people come into my surgery who have come here from Liberia to better themselves, or from Sierra Leone, or from anywhere else. And I think we have to have an honesty about why people move around the world for economic reasons. Doesn't mean to say you should have an open door in immigration terms. I don't support that. But there's a real argument as to how we, one of the richest countries of the world, should share the opportunities with those people who have far less. And that's why the government's very strong on, for example, making sure for the first time ever in this country we give the Brandt Commission 0.7% of our wealth to overseas aid, because we should. That's a minimum decency requirement. So, Ian, just to conclude, my hope would be that the Church, with its new opportunity actually under the new Pope globally and under the new Archbishop and Archbishop John, who was at Selwyn with you and me, although of course Ian and I look much younger. Well, no, perhaps we don't look much younger than John Centerville, perhaps he looks younger than us, I don't know. I hope we can become a church for social justice. I don't think we need to get hung up over the definition. I think people understand what we mean. We still have a horribly unequal society. Unequal in actuality and unequal in opportunity. And the gospel challenges us personally, but given we have an organisation which has more people going to it every week than going to league football matches, we should be a big player. The church is a big player, and it would gain hugely in public recognition and value from other faiths and people of no faith if it was out there battling for those things in a way that then was effective, not just making a noise but actually winning the argument. So my suggestion, in the tradition of Archbishop Temple, Bishop of Manchester, and then Archbishop of Canterbury, and somebody after whom this lecture series is named, that the Church needs really now to focus on how, not by just being anti-government, but by being anti-establishment and challenging to government, we can make what Christ came to do, which was produce a society where, not to argue for a society where everybody understood that God loved them equally and they were of equal worth, isn't just something that is a hope for the life after death, but is something that can be achieved much more imminently. And I end with this thought. My best evangelical friends always say, one of them sadly has just died, although in a good old age, always would say, I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday if I'm spared until then, or if you're spared until then. My understanding of the sheep and the goats story is that we're accountable, and we might be accountable tomorrow. But none of us know how long we've got. And we have to live our lives as a church as if we were accountable tomorrow. And bless the General Synod, and bless the Diocesan Synod, and bless the Deanery Synods. And I have a sister-in-law who's a priest in the Church of England. I don't often get the impression that the Church behaves as if it thought it had to be accountable tomorrow. And I think we need to think how we do things differently, how we go out and speak to the people outside more rather than the people inside, and speak minimising our differences and maximising our solidarity, A, as a church, and B, as a church with other people of faith who share our common values. And Blackburn Cathedral, like Southwark Cathedral, is lovely, and our churches are beautiful, but actually it's what happens outside the churches, in the streets, and in the homes, and in the factories, and in the youth clubs, that matters much more. And the more time we can be there doing stuff, the better. And perhaps we could end with a prayer, and then if you want to run away and find out the final score in the tennis, or ask a question, you can do that. So, Father God, thank you for being everywhere and at all times. Thank you for being there even if we forget you're there. Thank you for coming in your Son to show that we were of equal worth, because you died for us all without differentiation, and you rose for us all without differentiation. Thank you for sending your Holy Spirit to help us and inspire us and guide us and lead us and counsel us. Father, we just pray that in the spirit of Archbishop Temple and the great leaders of the denominations of your church, we may become much more energetic and enthusiastic and immediate about delivering the kingdom here and now. Father, help us to bring your kingdom today and this week and this month and this year to the people of Blackburn and the people of Lancashire and the people of England, and not to get lost in planning for the never never. And inspire us by your Spirit and give us the energy and the ability to be able to become a church for social justice, a church that is not the establishment, a church that changes our country and changes the world, so that when our time is over and when you judge us individually and collectively, we can look you in the face and you can call us home. In Jesus' name, amen.
I'm not very much into rewards, but there is a reward for giving a brother a cup of water. Text in the New Testament. Thank you very much, Simon, for those connections you made at the beginning, for the facts and figures that you gave at the outset, for talking about the origins of the language of social justice in the church, for making connection with William Temple, for giving us that rich array of texts, and then towards the end giving us those examples of social issues where you were challenging the church to address those structural questions, and for that strong theme that came throughout of being a church for others. I understand that you're not a stranger to questions and that you're happy to receive some. Is that right?
If
yeah.
You allow it for a few minutes.
A few minutes of questions, and I'm asking that the questions are, please, genuine questions and not long political statements. So I will come round and hold the microphone near you if you have a question.
I was talking to our Sikh chaplain at the prison the other day. We were reflecting on Egypt, and he said, Egypt's just one place that's having the same questions being raised as in many another country and in Europe and even in this country. And it's something about the divisions and one group in the society feeling they're being unjustly dealt with and wanting to assert their rights. How do you reflect on that?
I'll take that on its own, Ian, rather than wait for a couple of others, because it goes down another road that I hadn't really addressed. Having been privileged to go to quite a few places in the world outside the UK, although I've never been to Egypt, I've been to other parts of Africa quite a lot. Places where people cannot democratically exercise rights clearly need to be given the opportunity to do that if it's possible. I heard some wisdom somewhere in the last 24 hours reflecting on Egypt, but reflecting that we in this country took 1,000 years to get to democracy. We had rights first through the Magna Carta, and then we had freedoms, then gradually we had rule of law, and then eventually came democracy. So we can't be overly critical of other people who take much less time to do it or find it more difficult. I think that one of the interesting things is that in the age of the social media and of mobile phones, democracy is back to being what it started to be in the old city-states in Greece. I mean, that suddenly you can engage people really quickly, and the state can't stop them very easily, and that even in China now is possible. So we're going to probably see a world in which more people come more quickly to the streets and seek to do things by public force. I was in Estonia recently for the first time, which is a lovely little country which has had a terrible, terrible history of oppression.
I was sent there before
Oh, really?
the communist era.
Well, Ian, you'll know more about it than me, but they had the dreadful time under the Germans, under the Nazis, and then liberation came in the form of the Russians, and they were all sent off to Siberia and so on. If they'd had...
They believed that the war didn't end
absolutely.
until they had freedom.
Absolutely.
When I was there in '91,
Yeah.
they were expecting to become free,
Yeah.
but they didn't expect it.
And they became free partly by popular protest, and people, if you remember, there was a hand-holding along the Baltic coast of the 3 Baltic states, just people coming out saying, we want, and in Estonia they sang for freedom. And it was. So, I mean, my reflection is that the world is going to see much more of that interconnected solidarity than it did. Many more people are going to be wanting change and less patient about governments. And it's quite dangerous because, I mean, I'm not very happy even if the President of Egypt hadn't done a great job, that literally a year after a democratic election that he clearly won, the people are not giving him time to see out the mandate that he was given. I mean, that's quite a dangerous precedent, it seems to me. Just last reflection. Around the world, in the Muslim world more than elsewhere at the moment, it would appear, there are people arguing an extremist faith position. The Muslim Brotherhood is obviously Turkey has the same debate going on at the moment. In Christian countries it does too, but in a more disparate way. I think the job of Christians of the Bible and Muslims of the Quran and Jews of the Old Testament is to argue for non-extremist, non-fanatical positions that respect people of other views and don't seek to impose views. It looks as if why Egypt has come into trouble is that the Muslim Brotherhood government was really only trying or only looking after the Muslim Brotherhood people and not understanding that you have to be the government for all the people. And if governments don't learn that, even if they get to office on a minority platform or a extremist platform, then we're in for very difficult international times. India has a similar issue where the BJP party, which is a Hindu nationalist party, has been in power and could be in power again. Bangladesh has the same issue going on at the moment with elections coming up. So I think we have a duty to try to be supportive of democracy and supportive of leaders. An encouraging thing, Ian, I was very privileged with Peter Pike, who used to be the MP for Burnley, and a Conservative who's still in Parliament, Alistair Burt, in the 80s, to go often to South Africa to be trying to help with the end of apartheid stuff. And South Africa is a model of how you can have a revolution without bloodshed because of wisdom and generosity of spirit of people like Mandela and Tutu and others, who in the end were willing to be generous even though they'd been the oppressed. And I think that's the best example that we can all follow. I hope that was a bit of a rambling circuit round a very interesting question.
It seems to me that society since Mrs. Thatcher has predominantly made a god of money. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or visions on when this tide will turn, because I find that in the work that I do, even at the simplest level, where you offer to do somebody a favour, or you offer them something that you no longer want, that you feel that they could need, there seems always to be the fact that money needs to change hands. Oh, I must pay you, I must give you something. And it's difficult to do things, I find, without accepting that payment.
Yeah.
And it's as if we're making an absolute god of money,
Yeah.
which to me is appalling.
Yeah, you're very right about that, and it's interesting, isn't it, because this part of the world, did well for Lancashire and did well for England by manufacturing industry that sold stuff, and so knows all about brass tacks and being mercenary and needing to do trade and so on. So, I mean, people in the north are much more sort of no nonsense about these things. I think the tide has turned, is the good news. I think that the bankers' bonuses issue brought about the turning of the tide, and that once we had the collapse in 2008, people have started to say, look, these bonuses were just unacceptable. There was a guy the other day, the BBC man, I don't know whether you saw the story, who got a payout for 450,000, who gave it back. I thought it was wonderful. Oh, I'll just write a cheque of £450,000. But I mean, he shouldn't have got the payout, and he understood that. And I think we need, all of us, politicians and churches and people in communities, to just question, firstly, the high salaries and high bonuses. I mean, people don't need these amounts of money. They just don't need them when other people could do with them. Now, the argument is that, of course, philanthropy then applies. So if you're very rich, like the Duke of Westminster, that's all fine as long as you give it all away. And obviously, lots of rich people. That's the argument. It's all fine as long as you're very philanthropic. And some of them are very philanthropic, but I don't think that answers the question. The second point you made, if David Cameron was here, I don't know whether you'd ever invite him to give the Temple lecture here, but anyway, if David Cameron was here, he would say probably that that's why he wanted the government to do lots about the big society, which is about volunteering rather than expecting payment for everything. And it's a good idea in essence. And Conservatives would argue for a smaller state, and therefore for more people to do things voluntarily. Interestingly, a fact that is misrepresented, I had a bit of a go on Question Time last week about this, but the percentage of our national wealth that's spent by the state now is more under this government than under Tony Blair. Interestingly, it's about 43% of our wealth is public expenditure. So that although the total we're spending is less because of the crash. So we're not shrinking the state. Actually, a lot of the Tories around me and behind me would want it to happen. I think we do have to reinstate the voluntarism and the doing stuff, and that's about family and community. And sadly, I think traditional British families are now some of the least good at this. My Hindu best friends have the most wonderfully supportive extended family where money doesn't enter into their internal relationships. They just look after each other. They don't put their elders into old people's homes. They look after them at home. They see the obligation. They brought us up. We will look after them in their illness and their old age. I represent a borough where we have the largest African community in the country. They look after their extended families. They're not looking for exchanges financially. We're much more mercenary about these things often. Young people often end up asking for money for things when in the past they would just do them voluntarily, and schools. Now, just quick last two thoughts. Of course, if some people are doing very nicely and others are hanging around on the streets of Blackburn or the streets of Darwin or the streets of Liverpool or Manchester, with nothing to do, you can understand why mercenary things. I mean, may sound odd, but I've been through periods in my life when I've had no money before I was elected, just no money, no access to money. Other people in the audience, congregation will have been the same. It's very difficult and very depressing, and having money makes life much easier. Not having lots of money, but just having enough to get by is all the difference between sanity and insanity, between having something to eat and not having something. So having a fair society in which nobody is struggling with nothing is really important. Last point relates to the Egypt question. A lot of the world is very, very money driven and commercial. And a lot of the world where Christianity is less strong is much more mercenary. I went to Hong Kong once. I thought it was dreadful. Just dreadful. It was so mercenary. Money was the god. And a lot of those places in China now they're just temples of money. Some of my constituents go on their holidays to Las Vegas. I can think of nowhere I'd less like to go. No offence to people who've been on their honeymoons to Las Vegas things, but in Las Vegas, do you know what I mean? And if you go, when I went to Bangladesh, or when you go, many of you will have been to other parts of the world, the kids run along behind you and they're asking for money, backsheesh, they're asking for money. So there's a real money-driven culture, and we have to challenge it, and loving people and caring for them and providing. When people beg in London, which they do a lot, I have a pretty invariable rule which says, firstly I talk to them, because actually they probably need people to talk to them more than they need anything else. So I talk to them if I have time, and I say, I'm sorry my friend, I don't give money. That's not a very helpful thing for me to do, and if I give to you, I have to give to everybody else, and so we get into nonsense. And so I said, but if there's something practical, then okay, ask and I'll see if we can do anything. Now, that may engage. People actually more value the person who will spend 5 minutes talking to them with their dog by the cash point than just walking by on the other side and saying nothing. So I think you're really right. A culture of looking after people, caring for people, engaging with people, relating to people, loving people is actually much more valuable than the cash culture. Doesn't mean to say that we wouldn't all want to win the lottery. That's a separate issue. Well, some of us, perhaps.
Question?
Equality, we sort of always seems to be financial and access, but there's also liberty. If people are in a society or where they're totally dependent on everybody else, then they have absolutely no liberty at all. And in cultures where people spend all their time looking after other members of the family, for instance, they don't actually have any personal liberty because they don't have any access to resources. So there seems to me it's a little bit more complicated than just the two aspects. There's liberty and there's also access to the sort of money, food. And we've always been just talking about food and access to resources as opposed to just liberty as well.
Thank you. That's a good last reminder. I mean, there are two things, one of which you implied and the other which you expressed about. The other thing which people talk about a lot is equality of opportunity. So the opportunity through education to expand the mind and be able to discover your sort of inner spiritual self, your cultural self, and so on. So that's really important. There's this horrible phrase which is called social mobility, which just sounds dreadful. I keep on trying to persuade ministers not to use it, because I've never met anybody on the Old Kent Road who talks about social mobility. It's like pupil premiums. Nobody on the Old Kent Road talks about pupil premiums either. I'm trying to get government to speak in the language of sort of ordinary people. But the other is equality, and social justice has to give people the equality of opportunity for liberty too. And you're right about that. And you're right, it's very demanding if you're in an extended family where the obligations are that you will keep looking after your elders as a family, as a daughter, for example. I know a Hindu woman in her 40s who, I guess, will go on looking after her mum for as long as her mum is around, and that will be her job. And many people do that job as carers, as daughters and sisters and husbands and wives and partners and children and grandchildren. I don't have an easy answer to that, to be honest, because there may be a sort of happy medium in the sense, well, if government was doing its PR, it would tell you that we're really conscious we need to support carers more and provide breaks for carers and do practical things that give people some freedom from the obligations of those responsibilities. Really important. The internet, I'll make you laugh in a second just because it's been a bit serious. The internet, of course, gives people freedoms that they didn't have before, and that applies to older people and people at home and people who are disabled, people who can't get out. But you're right to remind us that liberty is important too. Equality of wealth and equality of opportunity are not everything. And China recently is, in theory, a very equal society, but liberty wasn't very equally distributed. One serious thing, and one thing to make you laugh, the serious thing is, of course, this challenge, the rising gap between the differential liberties and opportunities of the few compared to the many is absolutely not a UK speciality. I don't think there's a country in the world where the same thing isn't happening, whether you're talking about Russia or China on the one hand, or the States on the other, or Bangladesh. I mean, all societies are just seeing the few grow a bit bigger and grow wealthier and more powerful, and a large group being at the bottom and struggling. And the thing, just to make you laugh, Ian, if I may, in terms of people having a greater equality, in Southwark in Bermondsey we have an age concern day centre for the young elderly, the people who can walk into the day centre, and obviously they're asked what they want to do and what their activities, and they used to do crochet and all the things that sort of day centres for old people traditionally do. And they decided a few years ago that what they ought to do is give everybody a computer, so they gave everybody a computer, so they all come in to use their computer. And after a year they did their survey as to what were the best activities in the centre, and then so they broke it down into questions, and the best activity was the computer. That was the thing people enjoyed most, and they felt they'd gained more knowledge and so on. And then they said to people, and what do you use the computer most for, that you find most enjoyable and worthwhile and so on? Guess what the answer was? Computer dating. So suddenly, for all the over 55s in Bermondsey, their life was taking off a whole new meaning. And the number of weddings, Ian, for the over 75s has been going up like never before.
Simon, I guessed what the answer was. It's not because of the grey hair, but I guessed that it was the dating. But interestingly, it was Wednesday night. We had a wedding fair here, and there was one couple in their 70s, and I thought they were exhibitors, but they were not. When I saw them holding hands, I guessed they were coming to the wedding fair because they were going to get married. Shall we allow one last question? One last question, if anyone wishes to ask it.
One of Hackney's phrases that we get the politicians that we deserve. So obviously Bermondsey and Southwark are very deserving people. But to what extent should politicians be leaders, or in a democratic society, followers? And to what extent, I mean, you're talking about the church and its responsibility for social justice. To what extent should the church be working at the hearts and minds of people to allow politicians a greater freedom of manoeuvre to do some of the good things that we would like to see in terms of social justice?
Thank you. That's a very good question to end with. The answer is they should be leaders, but they should be increasingly better at listening to what their communities are saying, and MPs are better, and councillors are better. I remember when I first got elected, a Conservative MP, who is now no longer at the House of Commons, and I were coming out on the last day of the summer term, and I said to him, are you going off home to your constituency? And he said, I'm going home but not to my constituency. And I said, don't you live in your constituency? He said, oh no, I live in the opposite direction. And I said, really? And how often do you go to your constituency? Oh, as little as possible, he said. And I said, why is that? He said, every time I go, I get the impression my vote goes down. So, and that was since I've been in Parliament, which is in the last 30 years. I mean, obviously, 100 years ago, nobody went to their constituency from one year's end to the next. So, I think people are more in tune with their communities, and therefore they reflect that. But they should be leaders without being arrogant. And just therefore, three last thoughts. One of my greatest predecessors was a Quaker called Dr. Alfred Salter, who was the MP in Rotherhithe and then in Bermondsey between the 20s and the 40s. Started in the Liberal Party. He thought we let him down, so he left. He joined the Labour Party. He thought they let him down, so he joined the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, Keir Hardie and people. And he was a Republican, not a common trait amongst Bermondsey people. He was a pacifist, not a Bermondsey and Millwall supporter characteristic. And he was a teetotaler, again, not a common characteristic in the traditional native Bermondsey community. And at every election campaign, his agent would seek to persuade him not to talk about those three things in the election meetings, because they were not the things that would win votes for people. And in every election rally, he would talk about all three of those things, as well as all the other things. But he kept on being re-elected. He was a GP, lived in the community, with his wife, who became the first woman mayor. They had a child who they refused to send away and who then died of TB, because the social message of what he was arguing for jobs and housing and healthcare and so on, in the end meant that people may not have agreed with him about the other stuff, but they respected his principle and his rights to argue for it. And I think people will often vote for people who they don't necessarily agree with on all their issues, but if they have a clear view and they say they think it's honestly held, and they lead with that. The lesson for the church, I think, is a twofold one. I wrestled with the idea when I first got elected as somebody who'd been a Christian since I was knee-high, the question is, do we want more Christian MPs? Should we have more Christian MPs? Should we be praying for more people to be Christian MPs and so on? And of course the answer is yes to that, and we want Christians to go into politics just as we want them to go into teaching and banking and farming and churches and vicars and everything else. But I soon learned that just because you're a Christian MP, it doesn't mean, say, you're wiser than the Jewish MP or the atheist MP or the agnostic MP or the non-Christian MP or MP of another faith. So we have to realise that leadership and wisdom can come in other places and be open to that. But lastly, we really, really do need to be challenging people to be the sort of secular version of William Temple, so to go as Christians into public life, to be councillors, to be council officers, to be civil servants, to be members of Parliament, to be MEPs, so that the Christian gospel can be seen to be relevant to all these issues as well, without, as I say, being arrogant about it. And I'm not sure that we do that very well. I try and do it. I try to encourage people to think of politics not necessarily as a life career, but as something you might do as a councillor for a little while. My younger brother was a councillor for 4 years, then his fiancée told him that she needed a bit more time, so he gave up being a councillor, which is fine. But we need to encourage people to go into the lay ministry in public life and in politics as Christians, and without suggesting that it means we have all the answers or we know best or whatever. No, but we should lead. We should lead. And sometimes we get it wrong, and we should know that when we get it wrong.
Thank you, Simon, for leaving behind your constituency, at least for a short time, and leaving behind the trials and tribulations and joys of sharing in government, and for coming to Blackburn and giving of yourself freely with us, engaging with us tonight. So, thank you very much indeed.